Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, and this particular video is a long time coming. I'm an almost lifelong Sherlock Holmes fan. I would even venture to refer to myself as a Sherlockian. And for those who know me, the longest standing thing that I have yet to get into, really, and there are some Sherlock Holmes films and other things that I have yet to get into as well, but the most notable in recent years is the Sherlock series from the BBC, starring Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman, respectively, as Holmes and Watson. And I've only just finally been able to catch up with the first 3 episodes of Season 1, and they were just dynamite. So I wanted to talk about them. I'm not going to be going in depth with what the episodes are about and everything like that, but I am going to be talking a little bit about them and a little bit about different aspects of the particular, Holmes canon that I noted, references that are put into these episodes that stood out to me as a, Sherlock fan. And let's start with, of course, the first episode. There was a pilot made for this, which is actually, I think, only about 60 minutes long, but the actual, televised episode was the typical 90 minutes. A Study in Pink, and of course this is playing off the very first Sherlock Holmes story, A Study in Scarlet. Now, the biggest difference being with that story and the title and everything like that, in the original story there wasn't an emphasis on a woman with, wearing scarlet or having a scarlet, suitcase. As it is in this story, the original story was very much a revenge plot and had to do with Mormons in America, someone escaping from America, that kind of situation. And this is very much, as we see in that episode, something entirely different to do with a cabbie and poison pills and this woman scratching into the floor the word Rache, or R-A-C-H-E, which, it could be the German interpretation of revenge, but it's also potentially the name Rachel, as we see in A Study in Pink. These are aspects that are carryovers from the original story, even though the entirety of the rest of the story doesn't really play out, to fall in line with it. I thought it was very clever, though, to have Mycroft, Sherlock's brother, appearing this early in the series and being... You're almost misled because there's the idea of his name starting with the letter M and playing into Moriarty, who we get name dropped toward the end of the episode, and, Mycroft, and he's obviously sort of approaching Watson in a very ominous fashion in that particular, opening story. But I have to say, things like the relationship in the first encounter that Watson and Holmes have is very much taken right from the pages of A Study in Scarlet, and even down to Holmes's knowing that Watson hails from, the army, he had been wounded and all that kind of stuff. All of these touches are absolutely fantastic, and I like the idea of Martin Freeman's, Watson. He's looking for a new challenge, but, something to sort of fall back in line with the action, the adventure that he craved. And it's very much, he is the body and soul, if you will, of that, two-person dynamic, whereas you have Holmes, who's very much the intellectual, and he's not very emotional at all. He puts on his game face, and that's the only face he really has. So I like that you have the heart and the soul meeting the intellect and this sort of dispassionate view of the world, and they complete each other in a sense. It's kind of funny that everyone seems to think they're a couple throughout, the first couple of stories. Because there is that essence of, one completes the other. One is the missing side of the other that I really think gets put forth very well. They have a very good chemistry, these two actors playing these characters, and that's one of the strongest things about the Sherlock Holmes dynamic. I mean, if you get that wrong, you're off on a tangent. You're not going to be living up to the originals to begin with. But there's something about, even though updating, the Sherlock Holmes aesthetic to a modern sensibility, to a much more, in the now framework, there's so much of it, as Stephen Moffat would say in some of the behind-the-scenes features, there's so much of those stories that is very easily updatable. It very much conforms to, our natural society. Rather than sending out pages and letters, we're talking over the internet, we're talking over mobile devices, and there's still so much of it that lends credibility to it. You can see these stories unfolding in the modern world, much as they did, as they were, recounted, air quotes, by Dr. Watson ages ago. I love that the rooms for these two characters, 221B Baker Street, it's very contemporary looking, and yet it still harkens back to what you would expect for these two characters in sharing rooms. That sort of, main living room area with Holmes's just minutia all over the place. I mean, it's very befitting of these characters, and especially Holmes, because, I mean, in the one episode, he's got a head in the fridge, he's got experiments going on all over the place. He's got the dagger in, sort of above the fireplace and everything, or knife, whatever you want to call it, in the letters, which he opens the letters with, and just little things like that all throughout. But, of course, there's also more standout references, like the 3-patch problem, the nicotine patches referencing the 3-pipe problem from, I believe it was the Red-Headed League in the original, Conan Doyle canon, which is just Holmes's way of saying there's something I'm dealing with that's very perplexing, and I just really need to spend time thinking about it and obsessing over it. And I love that by bringing these two characters together in this first story, there's an emphasis on Watson's debilitation, so to speak. He's walking around with a cane, he's got a limp, and, it's Holmes's belief, much as his, the doctor he goes and sees to talk about it, it's his belief that it's psychosomatic. And in the course of the adventure unfolding, revealing this killer who's making people seemingly commit suicide, and it's all misdirection in this particular updated, version of this story, as he's caught up in it, he lets go of it. Watson overcomes it, and he's able to run around, and he forgets at one point his cane. I love that, because you have that solidification of the marriage of these two characters, so to speak, is perfection. As I say, one completes the other. And so that's really what I'm left with by the end of the first of these 3 episodes. The next being The Blind Banker. And there are a lot of different aspects that are playing into this particular story. The first one that strikes me immediately, one of my favorite all-time original, Conan Doyle canon stories, is The Dancing Men, The Adventure of the Dancing Men, where there was used these pictographic ciphers, to communicate, and a woman is threatened in the original story. And that's very much what's happening in this story, although it kind of also plays into aspects of like the Sign of 4, where you have, at least I felt, with the aesthetic of the crossbow bolt and, someone's life being threatened with that, kind of sort of, playing off of the poison darts that you saw in the Sign of 4. You had a smaller in stature guy who could climb into windows very high up and everything in the Sign of 4, who actually Holmes, I believe, kills in that original story in, self-defense. But you very much have that in this story. In this case, it's a woman who's trying to escape this criminal organization, past, basically, where there was a smuggling ring and all this kind of stuff. And it all has to do with this little sort of hair pick, thing that's worth millions and millions of dollars, and it's gone missing. And you have several different people who are, they've been murdered because this organization's looking for this item. One of them stole the item. And so there are loose aspects that are playing into the original stories. One in particular is the Valley of Fear, where you had somebody from the Americas trying to escape a criminal organization coming overseas, and then eventually fate catches up with them, so to speak. I believe it was a reference to Moriarty in the original stories, actually. And to have that sort of relating back to Moriarty, as is hinted in this, The Blind Banker episode, is very interesting to me, because I never would have expected who shows up as Moriarty, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself, of course. Still talking about The Blind Banker, aspects of this particular episode I loved were the emphasis on, this museum environment or library environment, protecting history, preserving history, and the passion which the sort of main focused upon victim, if you will, has for those teapots and keeping them moistened, because, the clay can break down over time, and it's become, an all-consuming passion for her in the better life she was trying to seek apart from this criminal organization. Unfortunately, it does catch up with her, and I have to give them kudos for that. They didn't create a character that you feel for and then is ultimately A-okay by the end of it. It's very much playing toward the realism of the cruelty of a criminal organization coming after people who try to escape, and it very much falls in line with the way the original canon stories were depicted. I mean, people died left and right. That's what Holmes was about. He was about deducing the entirety of the crime, and having characters that you attach to a little bit here and there. Not always in the original canon, but there were characters definitely that stood out to you and you felt for and compassion toward. And ultimately, they would meet their fate. They would meet their doom. And so to have that translating to this series, I think, is just friggin' awesome. Again, with this particular, blind banker, the idea of using those ciphers, I mean, there were a couple of different stories in the original canon that used them, but the Dancing Men being the most prominent in my mind because it is the most standout and most, one that I enjoy the most, I guess you could say. I revisited several times over, even though I've read the canon in its entirety maybe like twice, 3 times-ish. Stories like that I've read 4, 5, 6 times because it's that good. There's a momentum in that original story that these episodes wholly conform to. It gets you on the edge of your seat. It grips you, and you're dying to know what's going to happen. You're on the edge of your seat just sort of pitched to, wonderment, to excitement, to intrigue, who's going to die next, who is the killer, what's going on, and Holmes and Watson being the center of that, because of course, as I say, you have the heart and the soul that is Watson to Sherlock's, very dispassionate, cold logic in deduction. And again, I love the fact that he has a website dedicated to the science of deduction. He sees it as a science, even though it's very much internally. It's very much his own brain working and everything. And the conflict that breeds, because of course you have Watson with the blog. He is the chronicler, so to speak, and all that kind of stuff. But with the ties to Moriarty, it just sets up that momentum even more as the story concludes and we get into the third act, so to speak, of this first season. And that, of course, being the concluding chapter of these 3 episodes, The Great Game, as the title of the episode is. And this one, again, speaking to the building up of momentum and ramping up the tension again and again and again. This particular episode has a lot of different aspects it's calling to and cherry-picking from the original canon going on in it. But the chief amongst which is the merry chase, the game being afoot, or the game being on, as this particular version of Holmes says to Mrs. Hudson. There's this aspect of, it's almost like Die Hard with a Vengeance, which is my favorite Die Hard movie, actually, where essentially the villain is leading Holmes and Watson around all of London, attaching explosives to just random people and forcing them to communicate, be the through line from the villain to, of course, Holmes. And you pretty much have an idea who it's going to be. I mean, he's been name dropped twice as of that point. Moriarty is the mastermind behind this, the master criminal. And he's very much become the air quotes fan of Holmes, his analytical and very logical mind. He is almost the, opposite end of the spectrum in being malevolent, using the same kind of mental prowess that Holmes has, but on the opposite end, as I say, to the criminal element. Whereas Holmes is trying to be a consulting detective, this guy is a consulting criminal, mastermind and chieftain, And so you have that aspect of, these innocent victims. There's this explosion that begins the story. You're wondering, is Holmes killed? Did he get killed? That kind of thing, because it's right across the street from him. But this is all a means to an end to get his attentions. And you have this conflicting with Mycroft's own interests to do with the Bruce Partington plans, which was an actual story from the original canon. And it loosely plays, along the lines with that. It kind of marries different concepts from different stories in the original canon, in that you have these plans that were stolen, they're, relating to national defense, and it's a very governmental thing where if they don't get this back, there could be an espionage and other countries, winning over and that kind of situation. And so Mycroft, being a governmental worker of sorts, he very much wants, Holmes involved in this particular episode. And the way that particular story plays out, while all this other stuff is going on, Holmes deduces that all of that other stuff is to keep him away from, deducing where these plans have gone. Moriarty is, for all intents and purposes, after them, maybe, sort of. You're not quite sure by the end. But the whole idea being that he wants to get to him first if he can, or maybe he's having more fun, having Holmes and Watson jumping through hoops. But the point being, there's this aspect of, the brother-in-law or whatever, the brother of the fiancé, is the killer. This hails from another story in the original canon, not the Bruce Partington Plan story. And but they married together so well because it's almost a similar story. I think it was the Naval Treaty was the original canon story that did this. And it's a similar aesthetic in, government secrets are up for grabs, and, Holmes is coming in to hopefully chase them down. But as I say, in this aesthetic, they're chasing around to save these innocents and to crack these smaller cases that, Moriarty is challenging him. He's giving him a time limit. He's saying, figure this out. And there's, the first one is a kid who was killed in a swimming pool, and it turned out, he was poisoned. There's a woman who's like a, beautician with a television program, that she gives advice to people. And there's some ill manner going on between she and her brother and his lover and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it gets a little convoluted, but that's Moriarty's plan. He's trying to distract Holmes as much as he can. And how that all plays out, again, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, because there are things throughout the story like Holmes's ignorance of science and astronomy. This is something that hails right out of A Study in Scarlet. There's a conversation between Holmes and Watson about astronomy, and he's very much, Holmes, that is to say, he's very much about not keeping internally in his memory anything that cannot conform to the process of deducing crime and science and those kinds of things. Very sort of homebrewed science, in the sense that, chemical reactions and where pollens can be found in, geographical locations and all those kinds of aesthetics. He doesn't concern himself with, does the Earth revolve around the sun or not? I think he does open up to that later on, because there's another story where he can actually have a conversation about elliptical topics and such like that. But the idea that he has this level of ignorance, but it's chosen because it doesn't conform to the rest of his mental framework, I just love that. I love that they carried that over, and the embodiment of these characters, as I say, going back to what I was saying toward the beginning with the first episode, these are the characters. These are, the characters of Holmes and Watson, just in a modern framework, a contemporary framework. The essences and the banter between them, and the lightheartedness and the calculating precision of Holmes, and the heart and, the compassionate nature of Watson, this is them. If you go back and you read those classic canon stories, the portrayals of these characters is very much in line with it. I mean, people have said of the Grenada Jeremy Brett series, which is one of my all-time favorites, and probably the closest to actually being taken directly off the page in adaptation form of that original canon, people have said of that series that it is the closest you can get, the closest embodiment, the closest adaptations, as I say, of those words on the page. But character-wise, I would almost put this series right up there with it, if not a little ahead of it, because it has that momentum. It has that, building of suspense and expectation, and these characters are truly depicted as they are on the page in the original canon, down to comedic effects like, again, the head in the fridge. Watson is completely flabbergasted to his shooting the wall out of boredom. Just absolutely hilarious. Holmes does this in the original story, The Musgrave Ritual. He's shooting a VR into the wall, which Victoria Regina or something like that, reference to the crown. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below, but he's doing a smiley face in this particular episode, and it's just the absurdity of his nature, of his character. It's very much hearkening back to that original canon. People might be surprised to be watching this episode and think, those original stories, that original characterization couldn't be this hilarious, couldn't be this interesting. Letting Watson do some deduction, and, Watson, he makes a good effort of it, and then basically for Holmes, he got everything wrong, he missed everything of importance. That's something, again, taken directly from the original canon. The phone messages of the sound of pips, the counting down. Immediately, as soon as I heard pips, the original canon story, the 5 orange pips comes to mind, and the idea of a countdown building to something ominous. And, he utters the line at one point, "You see but you do not observe," or "You do see but you don't observe." One of my all-time favorite lines comes, I think it was out of A Study in Scarlet, where Holmes says, you see, but you do not observe. You see things cursorily, but you do not observe the intricacies of the scenario, as Holmes does. Very naturally, he looks at somebody, he can basically tell you where that person's been, what that person's family life is like, the age of their kids, depending on if they have any or not, just by observation alone. And that, to me, is absolutely fantastic, how it's brought forth in this particular series. Finally, we get to sort of the annoyance of the cliffhanger. I was really perturbed that we ended off with a kind of cliffhanger, but I mean, you can pretty much figure out what happens with the story, but there's this big time reveal to do with Moriarty, as it references one of the characters that is, sort of crops up in the story at the start of this third and final episode, The Great Game, as I say. I did not see this coming. Worth a damn. I mean, I was completely gobsmacked by the twist of who Moriarty turned out to be. I didn't even expect we would see him. And in fact, during that whole sequence when he's finally revealed, and I won't spoil for anyone who hasn't seen it, even this many years on, if you haven't, like me, you haven't caught up with it, shame on you. But without wanting to spoil it, that just flabbergasted reveal of who this is, I was left questioning through that entire scene, like, is this really Moriarty? Could this be a doppelganger? Could this be a dummy? Could this be another through-line character? But he's malevolent. He's psychotic. He is psycho to the nth degree, and the perfect foil and match for Holmes. And it completely won me over. I was like, with all of my familiarity with the canon, and it's sort of a loose memory thing where I have loose memories of it, and sometimes I have to jog my memory. And I actually spent a good portion of the time after finishing watching these episodes refamiliarizing myself with the original canon through the help of my the complete Sherlock Holmes volume that I have. But also, I want to reach off camera here to show and advertise sort of the bedside, bathtub, and armchair companion to Sherlock Holmes. This book is indispensable as far as having all of this great information about the history of Sherlock Holmes in entertainment media, as well as, little discrepancies in the original canon, and it's all focused on the original canon. I've even read outside the original canon, but again, even with that familiarity, even with that, jogging my memory, this series completely still caught me off guard, and I think it's attributed to what Moffat and Mark Gatiss have done in bringing forth these characters and having that love for many different interpretations of Sherlock Holmes, because there's a lot of talk of them liking the, sort of more modernized movies from the 50s and kind of trying to recapture that, modernize Holmes, but there's still a great emphasis on hearkening back to the original canon and appreciating that and a love for that. And that thoroughly translates not only in the writing, but in the portrayals, in the cinematography. There are some minor gripes that I have throughout the course of these episodes, but it's all to do with interposed stock footage and such that I just don't feel like it's a little bit jarring from the rest of the cinematography of, the episodes, at least for me. But that's the biggest gripe I can come up with, talking about this particular series. I'm head over heels for it. I was completely won over by it. And it's, again, a long time coming that I finally caught up with it to begin with. But, yeah, that's enough of my rambling on this particular, first 3 episodes, season 1 of Sherlock. I am greatly anticipating, continuing the series as I can get my hands on episodes and such, and DVDs. And it's all thanks to my good friend Howard, who made it possible for me to watch this to begin with, sending this my way. And, so greatest of appreciation to him and to all of those who are out there watching who are fans of the series or not. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Why or why not? What do you love about the series? Have you read any of the original canon? Has this prompted you to maybe be curious about those things? And so yeah, otherwise that'll be pretty much it for me on this. And hope this long-winded rambling video finds you well. And I'll catch you all later. Peace.